We're also starting the recording of this webinar today, so you may hear an announcement come through shortly. I'm going to take a minute just to go through some housekeeping announcements. So please take a moment in your control box to locate the question box. So if you have a question today throughout the webinar, please enter that question to the question box. We're going to be stopping in the middle of this session to answer some specific questions, and then we'll be following up at the end of the webinar to answer any additional questions. Also, we have a few handouts for you today, so please locate the handout section under your control panel. If you hit the arrow, you'll be able to access the handouts there. There should be 4 regarding the presentation today and also a certificate participation. So just so you know, we will be sending you a recording of this session. And we also have a survey at the very end that we encourage you to fill out because we are very interested in your feedback. That feedback certainly helps direct our further effort in webinars, and we value that from all of you. So before we begin today's panel, we're going to take a few minutes to ask you a few questions. So if you go to the poll box in your control panel, you'll be able to answer those questions as they pop up on the screen. All right, the first question we have for you today is we're interested to know who's participating. If you could just click all that apply, please do so, and we'll get a feel for who's on today's webinar. And today, it looks like we've got a large audience, so about 250 people today. Thank you. That's great participation. All right, so it looks like the majority of people are domestic or sexual assault advocates. Some are victim survivors, some law enforcement, case managers, and a few others. It's wonderful. Okay, let's move on to the next question. We're interested to know where you're located. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer these questions. So far, it looks like a number of people are located on the East Coast. Yeah, East Coast looks like the largest makeup of the webinar participants, followed by the Midwest, the Southern states, the West Coast, and a few from the mountain region. Fabulous. Okay, please share with us if you feel comfortable doing so what your racial or ethnic identity may be. This is totally optional. We're just curious to know. And you can certainly select multiple choices. All right. It looks like most people are identifying as white or Caucasian. We have some who identify as Hispanic or Latinx, and then Black, African American, or of Caribbean descent. Thank you. So tell us how you would define your community type. All right, urban, suburban, or rural. Yeah, it looks pretty equally distributed. So many folks are saying, well, it's almost equivalent, urban, suburban, and rural. So it's hovering at about to 35% for all. So that's great. We've got a good division from all areas and types of environments. All right, so the last question for this right now is certainly relevant to today's presentation. How familiar are you with domestic violence firearm laws in your state? All right. Great. So it looks like a large majority, well, some of you are very familiar with the firearm laws in your states. Others are saying not very familiar, very familiar. And a small percentage is saying that they're extremely familiar. And a few are saying that they're not familiar at all. So that's good to know. This really helped us. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. So next, I'm going to introduce our today's speakers. So Rachel Graber, you'll see here on the right of your screen. Rachel Graber is the Director of Public Policy at the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, amplifying the voices of victims, survivors, and advocates in the nation's capital. She is the co-chair of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence's Firearms Subcommittee, and is an active participant in many other areas of domestic violence related and intersectional public policy. Prior to joining NCADV, Rachel was a senior high school guidance counselor in rural Iowa. Rachel holds a Master's of Social Work degree and a Master's of School Counseling with an endorsement in gifted education from the University of Iowa, and is a graduate of Grinnell College. Our other presenters, Ariel Sangos, is with the coalition. I'm sorry, I don't know what this stands for. Anyway, prior to employment with CSGV, Ariel worked as a research scientist in the fields of gene therapy and wound healing and biochemistry and molecular biology. She volunteered more than 5 years of service as an advanced EMT and crew chief, providing advanced life support interventions in emergency crises. Ariel earned her Master of Health Science degree in molecular microbiology and immunology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. During this academic career, she explored health advocacy and policy coursework to then discover an alternative path to apply her passions. As a native of Baltimore City, Ariel has personally and professionally witnessed and responded to the impact of gun violence. She is a relentless advocate of transforming evidence-based research into action and policy, and will continue to translate and dedicate her skills as a scientist to gun violence prevention and public health. Yasmin Flair is our third presenter today, and she is the Deputy Legal Director for the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Since joining the Educational Fund in November of 2017, Yasmin has helped pass extreme risk laws across the country, providing substantive comments and testimony, as well as participating in working groups. She also works to address gun violence in impacted communities and looks at the intersection of gun violence and domestic violence. Yasmin's interest in working on gun violence prevention stems from the disproportionate effect gun violence has on impoverished communities, communities of color, and youth. Yasmin received a Bachelor's of Science in Communication Studies from the University of Miami and a Juris Doctor from the Georgetown University Law Center. Prior to attending law school, she taught 8th grade English as a Teach for America Corps member. So we've got a wonderful lineup of presenters today. We thank you all for your time, and we will now turn it over to the presenters to begin the presentation. Can't hear them. All right, please bear with us. We're having a few technical difficulties. We'll be functional. So you need to make sure that you're not muted on your end. You need to enter your PIN. It looks like you need to enter a PIN for audio.
Perfect. Hi. My name is Yasmin Fletcher, as was just mentioned, and thank you so much for that introduction, Gretchen, and for all the work that you do with NCADV. So as we get started, I want to give you a brief overview of what we intend to accomplish on today's webinar, and then we will jump into the material. So we've already had introductions. We will then talk about what disarmed domestic violence is. We will then we will look at the website, disarmdv.org, look at the interactive map, and do a deep dive into the Delaware state pages so that you get a sense of what is included on each state page. We will then have time for questions and answers toward the end. We are also requesting feedback from you on how we can improve this website, how this website can be more useful for you in your work. And so you will write your questions as well as any feedback into the questions box on your screen. And then we will end with a discussion of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act. And I guess before I get into what is disarmed domestic violence, I want to just briefly talk about domestic violence. So we know that when an abusive partner has access to a firearm, the risk the other partner will be killed increases more than fivefold. We also know that often before these tragedies occur, law enforcement has already been involved. One study found that approximately half of women killed by their intimate partner had contact with the criminal justice system regarding the abuse within a year of their murders. These interactions provide critical windows of opportunity to save lives. Restricting an abuser's access to firearms is an effective policy and can reduce the risk of domestic violence homicides by as much as 25%. So now that I've given a little overview of domestic violence and firearms, let's talk about what disarmed domestic violence is. As was already mentioned, disarmed domestic violence, or Disarm DV, is a joint project of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, the Alliance for Gun Responsibility Foundation, and Prosecutors Against Gun Violence. Disarm DV is primarily a website, disarmdv.org, and it explores the intersection of domestic violence and firearms at both the federal and the state level. Specifically, it is an interactive website that provides information for victims, survivors, law enforcement, judges, attorneys, researchers, on firearm prohibitions and removal of firearms in cases of domestic violence. As you will see, the website compares laws between states, presents statistics about gun violence, and provides information on the statutory process of firearm removal from persons subject to domestic violence protective orders. We wanted this to be a very comprehensive website that really looks at the intersection, as I mentioned, of gun violence, of domestic violence and firearms. And we hope that this website empowers survivors and their allies to more effectively advocate for and implement protections that will save lives. So Disarm DV is mainly a website. There's also a Twitter, which is disarm_DV, and there is a blog on Medium, and you can find that by searching in the medium.com, searching disarm domestic violence. But Disarm DV, the website specifically, includes an interactive map, which Rachel will go through. It includes domestic and firearms at the federal level. There's a federal page that includes the federal law and public health data. And then there is the state-by-state component. So for all 50 states plus the District of Columbia, we have information on laws, how to get protections, and then also by the numbers, which is the public health data. And at this point, we are going to transfer this back over to Rachel to talk about the interactive map.
Thanks, Yasmin. So as Yasmin said, this was when we started this project, we were really trying to figure out what could be most useful to people in the field. And so one of the things that we talked about was, okay, so we have a survivor who maybe lives in a state with weaker firearms protections, maybe needs to find a state with stronger firearms protections. Or maybe we have lawmakers in a state with weaker firearms protections who are looking for another state to model a new law after. And so we put together this really awesome, convenient, interactive map that allows you to compare different states. So you can click on a state, and when you click on the state, up will pop some information about the state. It'll give you the name, of course, and we'll talk a little bit, a very, very basic overview about what their law is. And then it'll also have information about, what you can and cannot do if you're subject to a protective order. So if you see on the side here, there are two different sections. There's a section called prohibitors and a section called removal. Now, we know that depending on the state, some states, I think there's one state that does not prohibit abusers, does not address a prohibition of firearms at all. But for the most part, most states have something in law. Sometimes that is explicitly talking about what the possession of firearms by an abuser, and sometimes that's really just giving the judge latitude, authorizing them to prohibit the respondent from possessing firearms. So that's the prohibitors section. The question, some states you can possess a firearm, but you can't get a new one, purchase a new one. It's really varied by state. And then the second part is removal. And so actually we have these lovely little question marks that if you just hover over them, they explain what we're talking about. So for example, under removal, the question is, does the respondent who is subject to a protective order that prohibits them from having firearms, are they required to surrender their firearms to either law enforcement or a federally licensed firearms dealer or another individual? And then if they are and they don't actually do it, does law enforcement have the authority to get involved? And so if you see here, we have different options again. So, for the prohibition and then also for the removal, you see that they're kind of both bracketing relationship. That's because some states have different laws depending on the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. So let's say the victim and respondent are currently or formerly married, current or former cohabitants, or share a child in common. A lot of states will prohibit respondents to protective orders in that kind of relationship from possessing firearms, but may not cover dating partners or cover dating partners through authorization, allowing the judge to prohibit possession, but not necessarily requiring it. You have the same thing with ex parte and final orders. And then on judicial authority, that really means, is it required that the person get rid of their firearms, transfer it to another, depending on the state, how that process would go? Or does the judge have the authority to require surrender, but that it's not written into law that they have to do it? And then we have the removal process. Again, how do they get rid of the firearms? Does the person surrender the firearms to an identified third party? Does law enforcement just go and take it? Or is there a hybrid between them? So if you look on the map again, let's say we are curious about, I have a final protective order and I don't want my abuser to have a firearm. What would be a state that I would be able to go to that I could have that protection? So you click on final. These are all the states that would prohibit a respondent from possessing a firearm. Now let's say I'm in a dating relationship. These are the states that would prohibit the respondent from possessing a firearm. You can also compare states. So let's say I would like to know how Alaska compares to Washington. You can click on both of them and click compare, and it will bring this up so that you can just see right there. It's really, really easy to say, okay, so, you know, I have an ex parte protective order. Alaska might not be the place that I want to go. Washington would be a better bet, right? So, you know, this is a really, really easy tool for people who just want to compare laws, for students, for lawyers, for victims and survivors, for advocates, and also for lawmakers and policymakers. So we have a safety alert, and there is a quick exit button as well. So we cover state by state. We also do talk a little bit about federal firearms laws. So as you know, in 1994, VAWA, the first VAWA was passed. And in that VAWA, there was a prohibitor saying that people who are subject to a final protective order issued after a hearing at which the respondent has the opportunity to appear are prohibited by federal law from having a firearm. Now, the term in the law is intimate partner, and the way that they define intimate partner, it applies to current or former spouses, current or former cohabitants, or people who share a child in common. So obviously there's a big gap there. People who are in dating relationships, if they don't live together and don't have a kid together, they're not covered. But that's what the current law is. In 1996, as part of an appropriations bill, actually as a rider to an appropriations bill, they expanded that to cover people convicted of misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. Again, though, that only applies in certain relationships. It doesn't cover dating partners. So when someone, we're focusing mainly on protective orders here. So when there is a protective order issued and it qualifies for the firearms prohibitors, every protective order theoretically should be submitted to the background check system, so that when someone undergoes a firearms background check, you know, the people, usually it's the FBI, depending on the state that you're in, can see, are you prohibited for some reason from possessing firearms? And so if you see here in the introduction, in 2015, which is the most recent data we have, there were about 900,000 active protection orders in the background check system, so that those people, when they went to get a firearm, if they were required to undergo a background check, they would be flagged as being a prohibited person, and then the transfer could not go through. So you can learn a little bit more about the federal firearms law. You know, it's in 18 USC 922 G8 and G9. You'll see if there's you can hover over the footnotes, all right, the numbers, and it will pop up with a footnote, so you know where all of this information is coming from, and can go look at it yourself if you're interested. For the state pages, we have information about how to get a protective order as well. You don't see very many federal protective orders. It's just not something they do very often. So that's why you don't see that particular section here. Again, we also have by the numbers section, which is just really talking about the public health data. And I know Ariel will talk about this as a general matter a little bit later. But if you have any questions about definitions, if you have questions about, you know, what's the prevalence of intimate partner violence, you know, what are we seeing in the Uniform Crime Report? You know, by the numbers is a great place to go. So I'm going to actually pass the controls back to Yasmin to you know, start digging into a state. And we chose Delaware because Delaware kind of exemplifies a state that has all the different pieces that we're looking for, so that we can show you the full functionality of the website. Did you get it, Yasmin?
All right, thank you so much, Rachel. So as Rachel mentioned, we are focusing our webinar today on Delaware. Just to give you a sense of what the website looks like, most of the information or the format for each state is very similar. So you will have the introduction page for every state. You will have the law page for every state. You will have the how to get protection page for every state. And then you will have the by the numbers page for every state. The introduction page also looks very similar across the states. In the box at the top, you have the first paragraph, which is about the statistics for the state with regards to intimate partner violence. And then the second paragraph is a summary of the laws in the state regarding purchase and possession prohibitions for persons convicted of misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence or persons subject to orders, and as well as removal. Below the introduction, we have another way to access the law page as well as the how to get protection page. So let's move into the Delaware law page. So again, the pages will look very similar across states. The information, however, is unique to the state. On the left side, you have this directory of sorts, this collapsible box that gives you an overview of the information that is on the page. This is useful if you do not want to scroll through the entire page. It's also useful if you want to just, I want to look at removal process. You can click on removal process and it will take you right down to that subsection on the page. I mentioned it's collapsible, so if you want to just collapse the entire box, you can do that. And that is definitely useful for states that have a lot of subsections. And again, that varies by states because some states have more thorough laws and others have less substantive laws. So going back to the top of the Delaware page, every state page starts with the domestic violence firearm prohibitions. It's overview of the persons who are prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms or ammunition, and that varies by state. As Rachel mentioned, very few do not have a prohibition of any sort. And so you'll have that information in this first section. You will notice that there are certain words that are bolded and italicized, and that is because we want to draw attention to some of the intricacies of these state laws. Delaware, there is a prohibition on persons convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence and persons subject to a protection from abuse order, a final order for the most part. However, where you see this may, a judge may prohibit persons who are subject to an ex parte or emergency protection from abuse order. We want to highlight that because those distinctions are very important as you are thinking about the type of orders that are available to you. Rachel also mentioned this, but we have this question mark, and right here, this question mark is providing examples of misdemeanors, crimes of domestic violence. So we have offensive touching, menacing, reckless endangering, and the second degree. And if you want to know where this definition comes from, also, as Rachel mentioned, you have the superscript that sends you to a footnote which has the code section for your use. And if you want to you can move your mouse into the code, into the box, highlight the code, copy and paste it, and put it into your web browser to search, or to any other database that you may use to search for code or the law of the state. So we scroll down to the next section, which is the meat of the law page, which is about the removal. Again, this is disarmed domestic violence. We are interested in the intersection of domestic violence and firearms, and specifically the removal of these firearms. So Delaware's civil protection order is the protection from abuse order. And each state has its title with the name of the order that we are referring to. Some states you will find have a few different orders. So we have civil protection from abuse orders that require removal. You will see this subsection, highlighting this subsection on state pages, so that it tells you that you're going to find out which protective orders require removal or do not require removal. As you see below, Delaware does not require that firearms be removed from persons subject to a protection from abuse order. However, the judge may order that firearms are removed. Again, we have the bolded and italicized text to just really hone in on these distinctions that are very important, and that may help you if you are helping someone petition, or you are petitioning for an order. It will help you identify, maybe you need to ask the judge to request that a firearm is removed, because they may not do it on their own. Also, so the next subsection we have are the individuals who may petition for a protection from abuse order. And like the title, it is the individuals who are eligible to petition for an order. So if you or someone you are helping needs to know whether they're eligible, we have a list of persons who may petition for the specific order we're referring to. So again, in Delaware, it is the protection from abuse order. And Delaware has a pretty substantial list, pretty substantive, of individuals who may petition for a protection from abuse order. And this is just kind of the list of other individuals who may not be listed above as family. We have former spouses, persons cohabitating together, etc. And again, if you have questions about where this list came from, you can see the code reference, and you can look that up as well. So then we move on to the removal process. This is a statutory process, so this is taken from the statute, and it's the process for removing firearms. And again, we have these distinctions with may. So if a judge orders the removal, this is a process that they may follow. For instance, it says the judge may order the respondent to temporarily relinquish to a police officer for the duration of the order. I'm not going to read through this, but this again is giving you the statutory process for the removal of firearms, what is required of law enforcement, what is required of the judge, what is required of the federally licensed firearms dealer. So then we move on to return of firearms to respondent. And this, again, is the statutory process for returning the firearms at the expiration or termination of the protection from abuse order specific to Delaware. We have, again, the footnotes or the superscript that gets you to the footnotes so you know where this information came from. And this is, we recognize that this is very much a law page, The next page that Rachel will get into is much better for understanding kind of step-by-steps what you should do. But this is a great resource right here on the law page to just know what the law itself says, what is required by the law. And that is what you have here for the return of firearms to the respondent. And then the last section on the Delaware page is penalties for violation. If an individual is a respondent to a protective order and does not comply or violates the order, there are penalties in Delaware, as you can see in this paragraph. And if one of the requirements of the order is to surrender firearms and those firearms are not surrendered, there are penalties for that. And so this paragraph gives you a brief an overview of what those penalties are and sort of the process, including what a law enforcement may consider when petitioning, when trying to determine if there's probable cause to believe that an abuse order exists and that a person has thus violated an abuse order, a protective order. I just want to add a few things. The first is you have down here the page was updated on September 5th. This you will see throughout the web page or the website. We want to be very upfront about when where the information comes from. We want to be very upfront about where the information comes from and when, how recent it is. And we recognize that states are passing and changing laws every day. And so as information comes in and we update, we will change the date accordingly on each state page as it applies. Also, and I mentioned this earlier, but this box on the left side, the directory, gives you a good overview of what to expect on the page. This looks very different on each page, each state page. Some states have a lot more information and others do not. So very briefly, I want to just take you to Montana. And you see on the left side that their directory is much smaller than Delaware's. And if we scroll down on the Montana page, there is less information. And that has to do with the law of the state. On the opposite side, we have California, and you can see on the left side that they have a much more extensive directory and more information on their California law page. And again, that speaks to how substantive the California law is. So I think I will leave it there with Delaware and let Rachel get us on to how to get protection.
Hi, thank you so much, Yasmin. So just as a quick background, first of all, we don't want this website to be used by survivors as their only resource. It's great information. I think the idea is to give survivors a little bit of an idea about what their options are, but it is very, very important, and we recognize how important it is that victims and survivors who are seeking help, seeking protection, or seeking protection from an armed abuser work directly with an advocate. And so at the very top, we always include information about the hotline, about Victim Connect, which is it's for victims of all crimes. So if someone needs help, but maybe isn't actually a victim or survivor of domestic violence, that's an option. And then always, if there is a page available listing local domestic violence programs, we always link to that as well. We can't emphasize enough how important it is for victims and survivors to work directly with a victim advocate. This is a tool, but it's not enough. Now, we do provide enough information that hopefully if someone doesn't have access to a victim advocate, which we know sometimes happens, just because the need is so great and the resources can't always keep up with that. So we do try to provide enough information that people can kind of work through it on their own, but we very, very, very strongly throughout recommend that they don't do that. We also have information about getting legal assistance, both through the Delaware Bar and then also for legal aid, so free and low cost help for people who qualify. So we understand that when someone is looking at this, they're going to be probably in a crisis situation. We always refer to the law page as the legalese page, and this page as the plain English page. We really want it to be accessible. We know that a victim or survivor, or maybe a new advocate who's working with a victim or survivor, they don't have time to sit down and read the law and digest the law and try to figure out what that means for them. They really just need something they can look at on the go to figure out, what the law can do for them and what they can ask for when they go to court. We also know that there are a lot of resources out there available, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel and duplicate the efforts that other organizations are doing. So when there is an opportunity, rather than putting the same information here, we link to some of our colleagues and to their websites. So in Delaware only has 2 types of protective orders. Now, there are some states, I think Virginia has 5. Sometimes it just depends on the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. Sometimes also it depends. Some states have emergency protective orders, and then also ex parte protective orders, and then also final protective orders. Every state calls it something different, which is why what you have here, you have the name of the protective order, and then you have a little pop-up bugle saying what it is, right? Because, in California, an emergency protective order is 72 hours, and then you go for a hearing for an ex parte order. Whereas in Delaware, an ex parte order is what I think most people would think of as a temporary protective order, before a hearing is held at which the respondent has an opportunity to appear. So we do try to under every heading, every time new information is presented. So we have how to get protection. We always define things, and then when you get to, again, how do you get a protective order, we'll define it again under each of these get help. On this sidebar. So we spell everything out, because we know that a victim or survivor who is in crisis, who has, starting to reach out to the courts, but really doesn't know anything about the process. They don't even know what they're called. They don't know that they're called a petitioner. They don't know that the other person is called the respondent. So we just want to lay all of that out. So when they go to the court forum, when they go to talk to the judge, they understand what they're talking about and what the judge is talking about. That's again why we say what possess means. And obviously there are all sorts of different relief available to people who are going to get protective orders. This is focusing primarily on the firearms, but again, when you follow some of the links to other websites, they do have more information about other relief. But we do want people to just be able to say, okay, I need a protective order. What does that mean? How do I get one? And then what does that mean for the firearms? Like, my abuser has guns. He's going to hurt me. He's going to hurt my kids. He's going to hurt my pets. He's going to hurt my coworkers. What can a protective order do for me? and for the guns specifically. So we know, again, we just say it right here. They have to get, courts can prohibit respondents to emergency orders from purchasing or possessing firearms. And if they are prohibited, they have to get rid of their guns within a certain amount of time. And then respondents to protection from abuse orders, which here is what we would probably call a final protective order issued after hearing, can't have guns at all, regardless of what the judge says. And the courts can get rid of them. Then the courts can either order them to get rid of them or immediately or within 24 hours. So we're not going to go through how you can get a protective order for every single state, because that information is already out there and available. Women's law does a great job of going through every single state. Here are the step-by-step, here's the relationships you have to have, here's what you have to have experienced, here's a step-by-step overview of how do you get a protective order. If a state has state-specific information available, the state government provides information. We also link to that. So Delaware has a lovely 45-page document to look at that. Sorry to move for just a moment. And then we again link to women's law. We also know that people, they don't know where to go. So we provide links to the location of the courts, so folks can find their nearest courts. And then most states have court forms online, and again, so we link to those. And as Yasmin said, we know that states change. Sometimes their laws change. Sometimes some of these links don't work anymore. So we are periodically going through and reviewing these web pages to make sure that all the links are still live. We also know that some people need protection, but maybe they don't qualify as a victim of domestic violence in a certain state just based on that state's specific definitions. So, a lot of states, however, have other kinds of protective orders. So some states would have a stalking protective order. Some states would have a harassment protective order. Some states have a separate, I guess we do cover the separate domestic violence and dating violence protective orders. Or they might have a family protective order that isn't related to intimate partner violence, right? So, or an elder abuse order even. So we do provide links, again, just saying, hey, you might still be eligible for a protective order. Talk to someone. It's always just is important to give people as many resources as we can without overwhelming them. So the next section is how can the court help protect you? Again, because it's a new section, once again, we are defining all of these terms, because again, somebody in crisis, they're not necessarily going to read up here and then say, oh yes, I remember exactly what an ex parte protective order is. We do want to make this just as simple and as easy for users as we possibly can. We talk about what the court can do, what the court is required to do right here. And then a lot of states, well, I guess not a lot of states, many states actually have some sort of process. So I'm going to just pull up Iowa, for example, meeting from Iowa. So you see in Iowa, depending on your relationship, the law is different. So if you are married, separated, or divorced from the defendant, they're called a defendant in Iowa, not a respondent, live or have lived with a defendant or have a child together. So basically, if you meet the federal requirements, the defendant is prohibited from receiving or possessing firearms. So again, some places it's purchasing, possessing, some places it's possessing, some places it's just purchasing, and that's why we do specify. And then in Iowa, if you are prohibited because of your relationship and it's a final order, there's a whole process that the court requires. So you have to order the defendant to give this firearms to a qualified person or to local law enforcement or local sheriff. You know, there's a whole definition of what a qualified person is. The court specifies a time period. That we didn't put the court documents here, but you know, there's all sorts of documents that all the people who are part of this process have to fill out and have to sign. And then there's a follow-up process to make sure that this actually happened. California is another state that does a really great job of that. You know, they have a, I mean, their process is so amazingly detailed. It's brilliant. In Delaware, again, and Yasmin talked about that, if the court requires the respondent to hand over their firearms, the respondent has to turn over their firearms to certain people within a certain period of time, unless the police officer asks for them, who's serving the order. Which
You're in on the other surface?
Not good.
Gretchen and Pat, I think we can hear you, maybe. And so and then, you know, I guess it's a choose your own adventure, multiple choice. So let's say the court doesn't require the person to turn over their firearm immediately to the police officer serving the order, or to a police officer, federally licensed dealer within 24 hours of being served. Well, then, you know, after one of those two are the case, then within 48 hours, they actually have to file proof with the court. So they can't just say, oh yeah, I did it. I did what you said. They actually have to go back to the court with a form that's been filled out, that's been signed by the recipient of the firearm, you know, under pain of perjury, that they've actually done it. We know that, yes, these are all great things, and, you know, it's really important. These laws and their enforcement are really important, but there are also other things that a petitioner might need that doesn't fall squarely within the rubric of the law. It would kind of fall under the judges being authorized to order whatever else they need. The victim needs to be safe. And so we do just make sure that victims and survivors and advocates who are looking at this website are aware of that. You know, for example, let's say you have an abuser who goes to court and they file their papers and say, yes, I turned in all my firearms. But the survivor knows, well, he turned in 5 firearms, but he had 7. So there are 2 more that he still has hidden. And I say he, just statistically, it's more likely to be a cisgender male being the respondent, and a cisgender female being the petitioner. So those are the terms that I'm using, but that's just for convenience sake here. You know, so maybe the petitioner is going to say, hey, you know, he has 7 guns. Can you please send someone out to get them? Instead of saying, okay, well, you can turn them in within 24 hours, right? Requiring the respondent not to just file a piece of paper that's signed by all the parties saying that they did get rid of their firearms, but actually go to court and physically be present and tell the judge that they've complied. You know, directing law enforcement to follow up, scheduling a compliance hearing to make sure the respondent hasn't gotten new firearms. You know, I think in some states that's more of a problem than others, depending on you know, access to firearms without a background check, access to trafficked firearms. You know, asking law enforcement just to stop by every so often, make sure you're doing okay. You know, also, if you know, maybe the guns, you guys are married and it is shared marital property. Well, the court can then say, hey, instead of giving the gun to law enforcement, you have to sell the guns to a federally licensed firearms dealer, and both parties get the proceeds from that. Or just really anything else you need to be safe, right? A lot of these things they would be putting in a protective order anyway, like a stay away order. You but it's really just important for victims and survivors to know that when they go in, they can ask for other protections and what's explicitly written into the law. Most states have like this catch-all phrase that judges can order any other relief necessary to protect the victim or survivor. And then just a little bit about telling your story. And this is going to be the same for every state. You know, when you're telling a story, you know, talk about what happened to you. Let the court know about the violence that you've experienced. And also, if a firearm was involved, it's really, really important to let the court know, so that, first of all, because there's a much higher likelihood of lethality, but also so that the court can take action and make sure that those firearms are removed. So again, you know, we keep this updated as we can. Oh yes, and also kind of in telling your story, if the survivor knows how many firearms there are, where the firearms are, the kinds of firearms, and that's especially if you have law enforcement either going to remove the firearms or, again, you know, somebody self-certifying that they got rid of their firearms. That's really important information, so that law enforcement and the courts can make sure that they actually were able to seize all of the firearms. So that is about it. I am going to turn this over to Ariel to talk about the public health information.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this webinar today. As previously mentioned, my name is Ariel Matsangos. I'm a public health fellow with the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. And before we get into the specifics of Delaware as an example for the by the numbers section, I wanted to provide a brief background. So I'd like to highlight that the purpose of the by the numbers section is to provide a digestible resource to a broad, robust audience that is, so that way it will be easier to comprehend the statistics behind this. And I'd also like to highlight that each state has a similar format, and the data for each state is different. So the data will vary. And that's because there is no federal requirement for states to report domestic violence related injury or fatality to a database. States can voluntarily submit reports and documentation to the FBI's National Crime Information Center, also known as NCIC. So the numbers that are available are usually available because states have voluntarily submitted them. Now, to dive right into Delaware, we open with a summary, which will be our take-home points of what we read throughout this page. So in 2017, there were 6 reported domestic violence homicides in Delaware. The second bullet, of those 6, 5 of those domestic violence homicides in Delaware were committed with a firearm. And this is all for 2017. In 2015, there were 1,789 active protection orders in the National Crime Information Center for Delaware. All of those included a firearm prohibition except for 3. And I say they include a firearm prohibition because of the disqualifying Brady indicator. Now, if we don't know what a disqualifying Brady indicator is, we can scroll down to the bottom of the page where it is defined. And we'll get more into the definitions when we reach that section. So the next subsection will be the fatalities, and the title of this figure is Domestic Violence Homicides in Delaware from 2011 to 2017. If you note, the number of domestic violence homicides is listed on our y-axis. On the x-axis, you have the years from 2011 to 2017. In our figure legend, you can see that the blue line represents domestic violence homicides, and the purple line represents domestic violence homicides by firearm. Additionally, in the figure legend, we can find that from 2011 until 2017, there were 55 reported domestic violence homicides in Delaware. And then in 2017 alone, again, this is going back to one of our take-home points in the summary section. In 2017 alone, there were 6 reported domestic violence homicides, 5 of which included a firearm. And we have a little bit more detail, including 3 of the victims were girlfriends, 3 were wives of these perpetrators. I also want to point out that all of the figures provided on the by the numbers sections for each state are interactive, and you can actually hover over points that you're interested in. So in this case, if I want to know how many domestic violence homicides were in 2012, I can hover right over that point and see that there were 7, or I can also read per the graph. I also want to note that you probably have noticed there's no line for 2011 and 2012. We don't see that extending. That doesn't have to be because there were no domestic violence homicides. We can't say that. There was just no reported domestic violence homicides. So that's just something important to keep in mind. We also have some additional notes, and those include the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council uses the term domestic violence homicide if the death was a result of domestic violence, either intimate partner violence or between family members. Domestic violence homicide excludes offender suicides and deaths by legal intervention. And if you find any asterisks on our figures, any of the figures presented for the states, that indicates that data is not available. Not because not because there was no homicide, but it wasn't reported. Maybe there was no homicide, but we don't know that. Again. And the third note is that the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council releases an annual report entitled Fatal Incident Review Team Annual Report, and this includes statistical data on domestic violence fatalities. The next subsection that we can find for by the number state specific pages are intimate partner violence, victimization, and related impacts. And as previously noted by Rachel and Yasmin, there are these question mark hover bubbles that if you hover over them, you will get an immediate definition of what intimate partner violence is for the state of Delaware. And again here, victimization related impacts. This is also included throughout other portions of the page. So for these pie charts, we are looking at the lifetime prevalence of any contact sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking victimization by an intimate partner in Delaware. This has been stratified by sex. We have both females and males. If we don't know what lifetime prevalence means, we can see that it is the proportion of a population who at some point in life have ever experienced the characteristic or condition following in that list. So for the female pie chart, you'll note in the figure legend that 136,000 women surveyed, 37.6% experienced intimate partner violence. In the deeper figure legend, we find that 62.4% of that 37.6% were concerned for their safety. This 62.4% is not related to the 62.4% who did not experience intimate partner violence. Again, these are also interactive, so just as the figures you can highlight a point, you can interact with these pie charts as well. For males, of the 108,000 men surveyed, 32.7% experienced intimate partner violence, 67.3% did not. Interactive. And notably, in both of these figure legends, we highlight that statistically reliable estimates of the percentage of female victims who were injured, needed medical care, or needed legal services are not available. And then we have our superscript with the citation and a hyperlink that you can access immediately, and another disclaimer here for male victims in the state of Delaware. The next subsection we reach is the domestic violence protection orders. In this figure, we have protection orders active in the National Crime Information Center for Delaware from the years 2006 to 2015. Please note on the y-axis we have the number of domestic violence protection orders, and along the x-axis we have the years 2006 to 2015. Per the figure legend, the blue line represents protection orders in NCIC. The purple line represents protection orders with a disqualifying Brady indicator, so protection orders with a firearm prohibition. In the deeper figure legend, we note that there were 1,789 active protection orders in NCIC for Delaware, and in 2015, 1,786, so all of them except for 3, had a firearms prohibition. Oh, I also would like to point out that in the summary section, you're probably wondering, this is 2017, the second bullet's 2017, but why is the other one not, why is the last bullet 2015? This is the most recent available data. So these dates, although it would be nice and it would be ideal if we could have everything be 2017, 2018, that's not possible. That data is not available yet. So this is the most up-to-date data. And going back to the last figure, as I had mentioned earlier, the note states, state participation in NCIC protection order filing is voluntary. Thus, the extent to which states enter the orders into the system varies. Regardless of how each state refers to their orders, the records are uniformly referred to as protection orders by NCIC. So NCIC standardizes them as protection orders. Scrolling to the definitions subsection, again, wherever you saw a hover bubble, you can also access it here, and for any clarification you may need. I also want to note that these terms are hyperlinked, so if you were to click on contact sexual violence, you will be immediately directed to a page with the CDC. And if you were to select domestic violence homicide, you would be immediately taken to a governmental Delaware page. And I'd finally like to note that as data emerges and becomes available, this section of the website, as the remainder of all of the website, will be updated accordingly. And that is all I have for by the numbers. At this point, we can jump into questions, if I can control the computer. So if you have any questions, please include those in the feedback box that Gretchen had highlighted earlier at the beginning of the presentation.
All right, thank you all so much. Because we're getting this on time, I'm going to highlight some of the most intriguing questions on here, and to the audience, we will respond to additional questions if we're not able to get to yours within this section. So the first question is, does it matter if the perpetrator used a firearm in domestic violence? So if the perpetrator only used personal weapons such as their hands, feet, etc., would they still be restricted with their firearms?
Hi, yeah, so that really depends on the state. In most states that have a firearms prohibitor, as long as there is a certain level of violence, then they would be prohibited under federal law. It has to have a certain qualification, so either physical harm or a threat with a deadly weapon. In a state that doesn't have a specific law prohibiting respondents generally from having a firearm, when it's up to the discretion of the judge, then in some cases maybe the judge would take that into account.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question. Who is the responsible party to report the orders to the federal database?
The orders, so the protection orders themselves?
Yeah, it just says report
Sure.
the order, so I'm assuming that's what that means.
There is no assigned responsibility to report orders. It's all voluntary.
And that's why, and we were talking about protective orders, and you saw, Delaware has what, 1,789 protective orders in the background check system. That doesn't mean there are only 1,789 active protective orders. That means that that's all that's been submitted to the background check system. We know that a lot of states, they don't submit, or they, a lot of times it's just a court by court. And courts with more resources might have somebody who is able to take the time to put those protective orders in. We also know that protective orders tend not to be a priority for people who are submitting records to the background check system. They're gonna, a lot of places, it's not automated. They just have a stack of papers, and there's somebody there going through the stack of papers, entering records. And so they're going to be taking like the felony records off the top. And protective orders, and then especially misdemeanor convictions, tend to be kind of lower in the priority, so those are less likely to get into the background check system. That is something that we are trying to address legislatively. Was it last year? Last year, the year before, Congress passed the Fix Mix Act, and is actually attached to an appropriations bill. And that's aimed at really improving the submission, specifically of domestic violence records, into the background check system.
Great, thank you. Okay, this next question essentially is asking, is there a federal database that keeps track of gun sales, or is each state in control of those databases for sales?
Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, yes, no, there is no federal database. Some states have databases. Some states have laws that can't have databases. I think that's something that the gun rights organizations are really passionate about, is opposing any sort of tracking of firearm sales. So in your more progressive states, a lot of them do have some sort of database. California does. So in California, when a protective order is issued, then they actually go and query that database to say, okay, does this person have firearms that they are just speaking to a licensed dealer? And so then they know that the person has guns or the person doesn't have guns. But in some place like Kentucky, they don't have a database or keep track of that at all.
And in some states, certain types of firearms are tracked while others are not. So that's another distinction.
Great. Okay, can you address restraining orders across state lines? So for example, if a client's abuser lives in a different state, if the client moves to a different state, and if an incident occurs in a different state from where it was filed.
Tell me if you want me to not answer, guys.
Oh, you can go ahead.
I'll just keep talking. Yeah, so actually part of the Violence Against Women Act, way back in 1994, I think it was in the 1994 authorization, is a requirement for full faith and credit. So all states have to honor protective orders issued in other states. Full faith and credit.
Great. Okay, give me 1 second here. What about if at the time of the final order, the defendant was homeless and then no longer so they move into housing down the line? Is the order still effective? Are there links to how a petitioner or original petitioner can have a check? Do you want me to repeat that? I'm not really.
Please.
Yeah, can you repeat the last half of that, please?
So if at the time a final order is issued, the defendant was homeless and then later obtained housing, is the order still effective? And okay, you want to address that part, and then I'll do the.
Yeah, regardless of where the respondent is located, whether they move, whatever, unless the protective order expires or a judge decides that it's no longer necessary, the protective order is still in effect. until its expiration date.
Okay, the second part of their question says, are there links to how a petitioner or original petitioner can have a check done? I'm not sure I really understand
Yeah,
that.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand that question either.
Okay, so we'll move on. So if the states don't have to report the data, then how reliable is the information?
That's a great point. I appreciate that question. I ask the same thing. There are initiatives and there are groups who advocate for better data acquisition services. So the only thing I would say about that is we cannot assume that it is a complete reflection. The data and the interpretation that we create from it is not a complete reflection of what is actually going on. And that's all I have to say for that. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, the next question. Is there any work being done so that it becomes mandatory for states to report domestic violence homicides to NCIC?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Is there any work being done to make it mandatory for states to report domestic violence homicides to NCIC?
so they wouldn't go into NCIC. NCIC is for active records, and if somebody's deceased, it wouldn't be NCIC. As far as like submitting things to uniform UCJR, what does that stand for? Uniform Crime
Criminal justice.
Court. I think people have been talking about it. I think people are a little hesitant to do that. Partially, I think it's interstate commerce, and it would have to be attached as a grant condition to funding.
Right. All right. We have several really good questions, so I'm just going to run through them quickly. Have you had much pushback from law enforcement about retrieving guns from citizens?
I can answer this one. Since it seems like we have probably not going to get to the Violence Against Women Act section. One of the things that we're looking for in the Violence Against Women Act is to allow jurisdictions that get VAWA funding from the STOP grants and the grants to improve the criminal justice response to use some of that funding to develop and implement some of these policies and protocols for the surrender and recovery of firearms, the storage of firearms, and then returning the firearms if somebody is no longer prohibited, and to make sure they can do that safely. And let's see, the Police Executive Research Forum, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Foundation. There are a lot of law enforcement organizations that are actually have produced all of these reports saying, this is something that we need resources to be able to do, because it's really important for public safety and for the law enforcement safety and for the safety of victims and survivors that these firearms are removed, but they need to know how to do it safely. And there are all sorts of other, considerations as well. I think one of the states, and I think it's in the legal section, the law section, about, like, for example, how do you deal with Fifth Amendment issues and making sure that someone doesn't go to surrender their firearms and then incriminate themselves because they're surrendering their firearms, meaning they have firearms when they're prohibited from having firearms. So there are all these different issues that they need to take into account. And it really is so important to have a localized response, because what you need in one community is not necessarily going to be the same as what you need in another community, which is why you need to provide funding for them to develop their own. But yes, law enforcement, I spent a lot of time hearing from them in support of this.
Great. All right. So will the website be updated by city for municipalities taking initiatives beyond state law regarding gun forfeiture?
Would you repeat that question?
Sure. Will the website be updated by city for those municipalities taking initiatives beyond state law regarding gun forfeiture?
Oh, I'm sorry. So my understanding of that question is going deeper and focusing on the cities within the states. And if that is the question. We are still in discussions about expanding the website to have the most comprehensive information that we can for all of potential users. That is actually something that we will write down as a suggestion and discuss. So thank you for that.
Sure. Okay. Are the firearms given back after the restraining order expires? And is there a way to continue to have them remain taken away, prohibited from buying, the perpetrator prohibited from buying firearms after the expiration?
Yeah. So again, I think that's partially dependent on the respondent. What we would like to see in every state, and California does this as part of their whole policy and protocol, is that when a protective order expires, they automatically, before returning firearms, do a background check to make sure the person is not prohibited for any other reason. As far as what happens after the protective order expires, depending on the state, someone would probably need to go to the judge and petition for an extension of the protective order, a new protective order.
It really depends on the state law, and some states even allow law enforcement to dispose of firearms if the respondent does not request firearms. Also, depending on the state law, it may be something where the respondent is notified that they may request for the return of their firearms, or they may have to take it upon themselves to figure out how to request the return of their firearms. So it's very state specific.
Great. Okay, so we have two more questions that's technically relevant to this. So if you take an order from one state to another state, does it have to be enforced the way it was written in the original state?
Oh, do they have to, is it the same relief? Is that the question?
They're asking, yeah, does that have to be enforced in the way it was originally written?
By full faith and credit, if a court in one state orders specific things that a respondent has to do or a respondent can't do, then yes, that would carry over to another state. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so do DV charges come up on background check for ownership of a firearm?
Charges? No. It's not until either someone has a protective order or they're convicted of a crime, for the most part.
Okay, great. All right, so we technically are quickly running out of time, and we still have another section. So my question to the presenters is, we can go for about another 10 to 15 minutes, and for the audience, if you want to stay and participate in the information and hear about information related to the Violence Against Women Act, we certainly invite you to do that. But feel free to leave the webinar if you feel you've gotten the information you were going to get. Also, for those questions that were asked that we didn't get a chance to answer, we will be responding to you individually. Again, please use the question box if you have information to share, comments to share, thoughts about ways we can improve the website. Please continue to do that. But we will turn it back over to our presenters to talk about the Violence Against Women Act.
Hi, thanks, Gretchen. So I'm going to be really, really quick. As you all know, we have been working for, 3 years now almost on reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. So we started by doing outreach to the field. Some of you probably have heard from us. To really kind of figure out what's working in VAWA and what needs to change, what needs to be updated. And so we got a lot of feedback. I think, broke into 22 different subcommittees to address specific issues. As you probably had heard, April 4th, I think, the House passed HR 1585, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2019, with really strong bipartisan support. We were very pleased to see that. And we are currently kind of working with the Senate to develop a bill that addresses those same concerns. And I mean, it's a process, right? We're working in a bipartisan fashion with the Judiciary Committee, and then also the other committees of jurisdiction. So most of VAWA is in Judiciary Committee, but some of it is in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Some of it is in the Finance Committee, and some of it is the Banking Committee, and some of it is in the Indian Affairs Committee. So it's a pretty massive bill, and it takes a long time to put this together. I just wanted to give you really quickly an idea of what's in there related to firearms. I'm the co-chair of that subcommittee. And so we're kind of looking at two different issues that really came up today. One issue is talking about who can have a gun and who can't have a gun. And then the other issue is really about, so somebody can't have a gun, then what? What happens? How is that addressed? So and we actually broke them up into a couple different titles. So one of them that I mentioned before, really quickly in passing, we are asking, VAWA provides, $222 million of state formula grants for STOP program, and that goes to 25% to law enforcement, 35% to victim service providers. I've lost track of my percentages, but it goes to 15% to prosecutors, 5% to courts and judges. So the idea is to really bring all the different stakeholders together to build a coordinated community response. So what we're asking for is that folks who get that money in their jurisdictions, if they choose to use it this way, can use it to develop those policies and protocols to make sure that abusers actually get rid of their guns, make sure there's some place to keep the guns, and then that they get their guns back if they're no longer prohibited. So that's one of the things that we're really pushing. Another piece is the prohibitors. So who cannot have a gun? As I said earlier, people who are respondents to protective orders or convicted of misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence can't have guns, but that only applies to final protective orders, and it only applies if the victim is a current or former spouse, current or former cohabitant, or they share a child in common. And so what we're asking is we expand that to include dating partners. We know that about half of people who are killed by intimate partners are killed by dating partners. We know that a dating partner, a dating abuser, is no less dangerous than someone who is married to their victim. So we're asking for that. We are asking for an ex parte prohibitor, because of course we know that the most dangerous time is when a person first reaches out to the court. So there's that period of time between when they get their ex parte, their temporary protective order, and when there's the final hearing, that depending, under state law, some states do offer protections from firearms, from gun violence in that period of time, but a lot of states don't. So we're trying to add an ex parte prohibitor, and then also to make sure that victims of stalking get those same protections. We know that about 50% of people who are stalked experience physical violence, and about 20% experience threats with a weapon. So we know that also that stalking is a key indicator of lethality in domestic violence situations. So we just want to make sure that people have equal protection. If you're a victim, is a victim as a victim, and whether they're a victim of domestic violence or dating violence, they're still at the same risk. So that's one section, that's the prohibitors. And then we have another section that's really focused on kind of some really basic law enforcement tools. If somebody tries to buy a gun and they're turned down, they fail a background check due to domestic violence, local law enforcement needs to know that, because they need to know that there's potential for escalation there. When someone goes out and buys a gun that they're not allowed to have, that often means that they're gonna do harm with that firearm. So law enforcement needs to know, so they can, check in, do a drive-by. They know their communities, and they just, they need this information to keep themselves safe. And then also talking about just making sure that federal law enforcement, the ATF and US attorneys are working more closely with locals. So it's doing some cross-deputizing local law enforcement as ATF agents, so that, you know, if you have a situation where you have an abuser stockpiling 500 weapons in Wapello, Iowa, and Wapello, Iowa has 2 law enforcement agents, you know, obviously those 2 law enforcement agents can't take, you know, can't deal with that, and so that they you know, have some, they can bring in the ATF to deal with that. Same thing with U.S. attorney's offices. You know, you have more resources. Also, in some states, you don't have these same firearms prohibitors, and so you have to convict or charge somebody under federal law, and only the U.S. attorneys can do that. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, addressing the intersection between domestic violence and firearms. I don't know if folks want action items, but, you know, we're working with the Senate. We're doing really good work, good faith negotiations. I think things are going very, very well. But firearms, I mean, it is one of those issues that make some people queasy. I'll just say that. We all, of course, know that there are certain people who pose a danger to other people who shouldn't have firearms, and their behaviors have shown this to be the case. And so we really need your help to reach out to your senators and just say, hey, you know, I work with these victims or survivors. I am a victim or survivor. I'm a law enforcement agent who this really impacts. And reach out to them, write an op-ed, make a phone call, do in-district advocacy, and, you know, just make sure that they hear from you and they know that it's important to their constituents, because what's important to their constituents is important to them, right? You know, they represent you and they serve you, and you have, again, you know, the power to fire them. And so they want to make sure that their constituents are as happy as possible. So we do send out action alerts. If you don't get our action alerts, I'm sure we'd be happy to add you to the list. But, you know, I'm always here as a resource. If you have an op-ed that you want me to, you know, run my eyes over, there's information in the handouts about VAWA, about specifically the intersection of domestic violence, firearms, and VAWA. You know, if you have any other questions about VAWA, I can probably, either I can answer those or someone else can answer those that I can connect you with. So just please get involved. We would love for you to get involved. Yeah, that's what I got.
Great. Okay, well, there are a couple of questions related to this section. If you're okay with it, I'll just read those out to you. Okay, so are they only prohibited from having a firearm with a final order? Or is it also prohibited during an emergency order and an interim order?
Under federal law, it's only if it's a final order issued after hearing, but state laws are different.
Right, so I see that. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. What about prohibiting firearms to abusers who use strangulation? So do you prohibit or can they prohibit firearms to abuse who use strangulation?
Yeah, I mean, someone who uses strangulation, if there's a protective order or if there's a conviction under federal law, depending on the relationship, they would automatically be prohibited. But if you have a state where the judge has more latitude, if someone comes in having experienced strangulation, the judge is much more likely to A, issue a protective order, and B, prohibit the respondent from possessing firearms, because we all know the lethality checklist, and that is one of the highest indicators of risk of lethality.
Could I also just add that some states to issue a protective order with a firearm prohibition do require that a firearm be a part of the violence that led up to the protective order. There aren't many states, but that is in some.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. That looks like it. That's the end of the questions related to VAWA. We'll just wrap up the webinar now. So please know that you will be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow that will include a link to a recording of the webinar, links to the handouts, and certificate of participation. We will also include a link to how you can join the NCADV's email and receive those action alerts, as well as a general email address for NCADV if you have additional questions. Lastly, we would like to encourage you to join us on Wednesday, July 17th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time for Successful Rules Reduction Implementation Process in Domestic Violence Shelters from Vision to Practice. So again, thank you to all of our presenters. This was a very enlightening session, and I learned a lot about domestic violence and firearms. Thank you all who attended, and we hope to see you again in the future.